Hello, everybody. Rob Nelson here. Today, I am doing a Stone Age Man Talks podcast, something that I will be doing now and into the future with Kevin Cain. Kevin has been working in the pharmaceutical industry for 30 years, and I've been talking to so many people trying to figure out how can we navigate this system to be healthier and happier. That's part of the Stone Age Man ethic. Because I'm a biologist, I look at humans as a species. How were we adapted and how are we not adapted to this modern world that we live in? How can we tweak the systems that we are in now to make ourselves better? Now, when I talk to doctors have a particular perspective. Sometimes they say, oh, the problem is insurance, or oh, it's the people that come in, they just don't take their medication. Or when I talk to insurance people, they say, oh, the problem is doctors don't really know what they're doing, or X, Y, Z. Everyone has a unique perspective. Right now, there's a lot of debate about where is the problem in health. I wanted to start getting to the bottom of this by talking to interesting people in all of these different fields. Kevin has proven to be such an amazing resource for me to talk about things from the pharma perspective because he's worked in it for 30 years. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the history of pharma from his perspective, where he thinks the problems are. Can we get to a system more, where everyone's healthier? Let's put it that way. So we talk about a little bit like, why can't we go to Sweden's system, or could we? We talk a little bit about how can we solve the obesity crisis. I think you will find most of these interesting. I will say, unfortunately, when we went back to review the content of the podcast, the video button on the podcast app did not get clicked on. So I'm just going to leave pictures of Kevin and I and just put this out anyway, even though we recorded it like this and it did not happen. So let's get right to our conversation. Do you want to walk us through, from your understanding, how we got to where we are right now?
It's a long story, obviously, right? And can be a little convoluted time, but really the base of it does come from natural medicine, right? Mm-hmm. So, and they are still utilizing aspects of nature, right? So some of the most powerful medicines came from soil samples, like on Easter Island. Rapamycin came from that. So as a more of an extreme example. But, they have looked to nature and come from that because that's some of the first places where we learned that there could be effect. I think what you had, over time is, you get that snake oil, and snake oil is just someone said, oh, this works, that doesn't work. And you never knew what the truth was, right? So you have let's just start 1700, something like that, right? So where it was anecdotal, it was, and some of those things really worked. The most famous of all is willow bark with aspirin. That was developed right from just what people observed in terms of effects when they would use something from a natural base, and they had teas and all that. And so it became like, well, what is really working, what's not, and what was healthy for you and what wasn't. I mean, cocaine was pretty common. I mean, cocaine was in Coca-Cola, right? So that lifted you up. You had caffeine and cocaine. Was that necessarily good for people to have over time? It did have an effect, but what was going on? So I think, a lot of innovation started coming out of really war, right? So the earliest companies came from that, and it came from really chemical synthesis. So the earliest pharmaceutical companies came out of dyes and textiles, because that was one of our first industries where you were really using kind of chemicals and developing things and kind of compounding things outside of like shamans or midwives, people doing things on their own. And so, it started that way, and they took, aspirin was one of those first things developed in the late 1800s. To put together, and you started getting it more formalized, and some of those innovations came from war. Like Squibb and Sons was founded based around the Civil War, when they figured out how to make ether from alcohol, right? So they derived from that. It's all kind of related to that chemical synthesis in terms of some of the background and isolating what the specifics were that could have an effect, right? But you weren't doing clinical trials. You just did it by, just trying it on people, right, and then seeing what works over time. And then, a lot of that, as those industries grew, there wasn't, maybe that regulation. And then you have like the early 1900s, 1911 through 1930, where we got a lot of more formal government regulation to kind of put parameters around things to make things more safe for people.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because it seems to me, when I'm listening to you talk, that the current system that we have is partly trying to refine and improve upon the incentive system. So back in the day, if you had snake oil salesmen, clearly there was an incentive from them marketing it, trying to claim that it was good. And yet, we have so many people in the country, that's not a good thing. And so there was started to be regulations, and we started to try to figure out, like, well, how do we make it so that person can't make a profit? And that might have been different than the incentive system in a small Amazonian village, where if somebody gives something that doesn't work and they die, then it doesn't go very far.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm just kind of imagining this incentive system. And I think maybe where we are today is a lot of people feeling like something's wrong and that the incentive system is broken in certain ways, like not always, but I'll give you an example for something that's maybe like more immediate to me. So I don't know how familiar you are with Klonopin. Clonazepam, I think is also the name for it. It's a benzodiazepine that's really common and used to treat people with depression.
Yep.
And so there was a time,
old school, one of the earliest ones that were used, right?
And I think I don't know how much it's adapted, but I chatted to my friend Louise, who I've known for a long time. She's Swedish. Jonas and I, it's his wife. She's in med school, and she told me as she was shadowing one of the doctors in med school, she's like, yeah, the doctor said, Klonopin is amazing. I mean, if anybody has literally any ailment, you can give them Klonopin and they will get better. It's like, I give it out like candy. She was telling me this. I was like, oh my gosh, that's not good, because I had just had an experience myself where I had gone in at one point in about 2017 to the doctor. I was super stressed. I was anxious, couldn't sleep. Looking back, it was clearly because I was having some issues with work, and I was trying to make this business work, and yet I couldn't. And so clearly that was causing me some anxiety. And the doctor maybe saw me for a few minutes. I filled out a form. She said, oh, you have depression? Here, why don't you try to take some of these Klonopin? And I was like, okay. I mean, I will if you think it is, but I'm not really so sure. And she's like, look, it'll help you. Just take it. Well, I definitely started taking it, and it worked. That's the magic of, pharmaceutical pills in some ways. But then I got hooked on it, and then I couldn't get off of it. And I didn't really need it, but getting off of it was so incredibly difficult, and it had a lot of side effects. And I think that was somewhat of a problem, because nobody ever talked to me about maybe what are the things I could have been doing. Maybe it was a little bit of diet change. Maybe it was I needed to just fix the business or figure that out. And yet the immediate solution was something that became very difficult to get off of. And I don't know what the percentage of people that are on antidepressants now. I think that would be considered an antidepressant. But it's just the incentive for doctors just seems now to be, let's give someone this thing that will work, and let's not think about the longer term consequences. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think, first of all, I think that doctor wasn't practicing good medicine, personally. So I would say, from my experience, a third of doctors should not be practicing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
and why do you say that?
I've interviewed, part of my job, what I've done is interview doctors across many different specialties, or I've been running kind of marketing research studies where we talk to them. So thousands of doctors over the years, and some of them I'm kind of scared on a regular basis.
Do they just not seem that smart, or do you feel like their training is off? Like, what's the problem?
Well, they're smart. They're good test takers, right? To be a doctor, you have to be a good test taker, right? So it's not that they're unintelligent, but they get into their kind of ruts, their modes, and they just kind of follow a script. And it depends on the specialty and all that, but they have such a large volume coming through, and it's gotten worse over time, that they just go with kind of a standard algorithm that they kind of follow, right? And they don't really think through it, and they have perceptions that, okay, a patient comes in, they want a drug, so I just have to prescribe one. I have to think of it. And they just know something like Klonopin is actually kind of surprising. It's usually it's pretty powerful, and it has a lot of side effects. And it's usually not the first thing you would give for depression in America these days. That would not be a first line. You would go to SSRI or something like that, right? So we could get into the neuro stuff. It does get more complicated because it does take a while for that to ramp up. To come down off of it takes a long time, because you're really kind of messing with brain chemistry, and in terms of building up tolerance and all that, it gets complicated. So your story is not surprising in terms of, yes, you had an effect and that you had side effects, and that coming off of it was not that easy, right? So I think first line therapy probably is looking at other things like your diet, looking at exercise, trying to look at maybe a cognitive therapy more for a doctor. But they kind of tend to ignore that, because like, if you're here now, the doctor feels like, oh, I have to do something active, and I have to give you that pill. It's kind of the same with diabetes. And in terms of really first line therapy is not a drug. And we'll say type 2. Type 1, when you need insulin, is a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And that's an autoimmune disease. It's a little bit different. But really, first-line therapy is diet and exercise. When you read the package insert for a diabetic medication, it's a second-line therapy. So it's when diet and exercise has failed. But the first thing the doctor says many times, and not all doctors, but they, okay, your type 2 diabetes, you should do diet and exercise and then follow some sort of protocol like that. They don't. They just go, okay, here's a drug. And then you're tied into that usually for the rest of your life, right? Yeah, and they don't really go back to that. Or the drug is a short-term thing to help manage your metabolism until we can get your diet and exercise and focus on it. Because they feel like, oh, well, people are too lazy. People aren't going to do that. And they just do that. So I think part of it is medical training. So, some of it is just maybe laziness, and some of it is doctors are overwhelmed and they want the easy way out, to be honest with you. And I can understand how that happens.
Do you think we've conflated a lot of roles into what we now see as doctor? I started to think a little bit about this because I have, at some point in, I guess it was May, I made a post and invited people to join me on a fitness journey, because I found that by changing my diet and increasing my exercise in the right way, it actually improved a lot of ailments that I had. So I got 10 people to join me, and I've been trying to get these 10 people to be a little bit more fit and to change some habits. And what I found is that it's a little bit like being their doctor, in that they're telling me, oh, I can't sleep, I have this problem here or this injury here. And then I'm kind of their first person that they come to. But I'm also a little bit like their trainer. So I give them exercises to do, and I say, do this in this certain way and maybe stretch here. But then at the same time, it's also psychological, right? And I've had other people who are trainers say that they got into psychology because of this. Because when you're really trying to get fit, in some ways, especially if you're getting over bad habits, it's not just about knowing what exercises to do. It's figuring out why in your brain you can't do the things that you want to do. And so when you go to the doctor, you're trying to see them as somebody who knows pharmaceuticals. They know how to maybe suture up an injury. They are also your psychologist. They're also your trainer, maybe your health person. And maybe they don't have all those expertise. Maybe they really are best at suturing up people and curing things that need some antibiotics or something like that. Do you think that's... fair
I,
assessment? I mean, we're
I,
piling too many things on what should be a doctor, and they don't have the training and some of those other things.
well, it's fair. It's like how are we defining it? And this gets back to how are they trained? What is their role in terms of medicine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and when you go back to it, you know, they're really medical school. Let's say, you know, the past 100 years, you really only had more regimented medical training, to be honest, right? So 150 years ago, you didn't have it as you do now. But it's really get rid of infection, get rid of viruses, right? So it's just to keep you alive. That is the goal, right? So, and because people were dying, so, you have polio, you have antibiotics, and that was the first thing, is just, let's keep you alive, let's take care of that. And then things have evolved from there to be more specific to the type of conditions that you have based on the body system.
Well, and health is so broad, right? It's not just what diseases and parasites do you have in you. It's how do you integrate within the community? What is your, to some degree, what is your spiritual life, if that's some term that you use? Do you have friends? Do you work out? Do you eat right? I mean, all of those things, which are maybe like 5 things combined into one. And so I guess maybe sometimes I wonder if we're conflating, like people have dropped out in key pieces that they need in their life. Like, from a spiritual perspective, maybe the priest would tell them, oh, you need to mix into the community. Maybe you need to have friends. And they're just going to the doctor and saying, I'm stressed. What do I do? And they say, here's a pill. Yeah. And that can be a problem. Right? It
is a lot, though, because it's about looking at the complete person, right? And so where we have doctors is it's only when you have like symptoms and you have a specific medical problem, right? And they want to treat it. And they're not, even though doctors have a class, they'll have a class in nutrition. They'll have a class in, kind of wellness or prevention, right? Wound care, there's things like that, but it's a class.
Right.
But it's not part of their overall training, and we're not looking at prevention or wellness. That's not how we generally treat doctors. I think more doctors are trying to go that way, and you see these concierge doctors, which are being kind of broader spectrum, so to speak, in terms of the aspects of the whole person. And I think we forget that. Like, I think your trainer situation is very true. Like a really good trainer, it becomes like you're a therapist, right? Your friend. And I have that relationship. But I think when we first started talking was related more to the fitness, and I already had kind of someone I was working with and everything. But, we don't always take into account. We just think that that's exercise or it's just diet, and that's it. We don't take into effect sleep. We don't take into effect stress and how that affects them. We know stress with cortisol has many ramifications to the body, right? So that is that stress from just anxiety because you have some sort of neurological kind of disorder, or is it just a short-term thing, just your life is kind of crazy type of thing? And I think they don't always take that into account. A lot of times people can't lose weight, and it's a combination of things, but it could just be the stress that's holding it back. I know for me, that's happened to me where I'm stressed and it's like, okay, I'm doing the diet as you should, and I'm following the macros, working out 5 days a week, I'm doing everything, and you should be dropping, right? And I'm not. It's like, why? Sleep and stress, so that things I work on, but nobody takes that into account, right? And it's like, and I think that, there's not enough of a holistic view, and maybe we're putting too much on doctors, or we need to redefine what a doctor is there to do.
Well, I think a lot of the discussion right now is talking about who do we blame. A lot of people, and I'm not even going to say what side of the political spectrum people are talking about this, because I don't think it necessarily matters, but a lot of people are arguing who should pay, right? Like, the problem is more people need to pay for this or more people need to pay for that. Some people are saying, we need to get rid of the chemicals in our food supply. That's what's causing people to be obese. Some people are saying, we need to get rid of insurance companies. That's the problem. Part of my view is that I think people need to take health into their own hands just a little bit more. and have a holistic view of their entire lives. But that's tricky because that means that you have to start doing education on your own.
Yeah.
Like each individual person has to take their health into their hands and learn about, which is really difficult. I think the older way of thinking about it is like, well, if something happens, then I just need to go to the doctor and they'll fix it. And the doctor will tell me to take this or take that,
Yep.
and I'm good. And I say that because I kind of had an epiphany when I started working with Amanita muscaria, which is that red and white Mario Brothers mushroom that's really famous. And I was working directly with a friend of mine, Louise, who is Swedish and in med school. And I found this mushroom in Sweden. And she said, absolutely no one ever uses that mushroom. That is toxic. It will kill you. And I was like, okay, well, I hear you, but you can at least touch it. They wouldn't let their kids near it. Nobody would touch that thing. And when I started doing the research, I found that it actually is something that people have used for a long time, but it did get squished at some point in maybe the 1500s. And all records of it got like basically disappeared. But that the current research, very limited current research, is indicating that it can be very helpful. And yet, medical doctors are still not going to touch it. It's like moving a giant ship. It's not going to turn very easily. It may take 100 years for that ship to turn back around. But that what I found is that if I start using it as a natural medicine and I prepare it, and I find out what my low dose is, and in other words, the threshold where I can start to feel a dose, because it's going to be a little bit different for everyone, then it actually allows me to get in touch with my own body and listen to my own body. And I can actually get some benefit from that. And that translated not just to was the chemicals within this mushroom helping me, but it was allowing me to listen to my body. You see, so it was my first introduction to using natural medicines. And I started to realize that really what it was is me learning to listen to my body and then work with somebody who maybe knows a little bit more about it to help me figure out, okay, what are the things I need help with? Well, here's the range of things that I could use. And they don't have to be natural medicines, right? Like it's obviously, I'm kind of a believer in the idea that these biological organisms have biological compounds that you're using in particular, right? So it's not just like the whole essence of the being, although I like that idea too. And so, yeah, I'm starting to think that maybe you do just need to start to take health into your own hands, and that is a big step. And so I'm trying with some of this to teach people, give people the tools to learn it on their own. But I don't know how we get there because there's so many people that are in this system. Well, the doctors are the ones that have all of the answers. We just need to go to them. You see what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's what people used to do, right? So 300 years ago.
Do you think people used to do that more? Well, why is that?
I think so, because you didn't have any other choice, right? So
right. Well, that's true. We also didn't have the internet, and we're somewhat limited.
Yeah, they didn't, and you had to this was what works for me, right? So it gets more complex because everybody may respond differently to medications or to food. There's allergies. I mean, it gets to where what works for you doesn't necessarily work for me. And it's, you just have to keep trying different things to see what works for you. So it does get complicated, but it helps having some sort of expert. And, there have always been experts, like you said, shamans, or the expert, like, okay, you have this problem. Here's a way to fix it based on their experience and, numbers of people over time. Right. So they may not have understood why, but they worked around that. And we still have kind of that system in a way, but we have much more knowledge to try to guess and shortcut to, reduce risk in ways to approach things. Right.
Right.
But we're still learning that it's not always so simple. You turn on one system, you turn off another. That's where you run into this, giving you one drug to treat this, and it creates a symptom of something else. And then I give you another drug and another drug, people are on 12 drugs.
Yes.
because somebody didn't step back and say, okay, let's look at your whole system. Let's look at you holistically. Instead of you going to 3 different doctors giving you 3 different things, why don't they all talk? And why don't we look at overall and really get to the cause, not the symptom? We tend to treat symptoms, not the cause all the time.
Right. So it seems to me with a lot of the people I talk to, even doctors, everyone can agree we need to look at people more holistically. Because you're a little integrated into the system, so to speak, because you've done marketing and stuff for pharmaceuticals. Why is it that we can't get there? Why does it seem to be continually moving I say continually moving. When I was growing up, we had our family doctor, and our family doctor seemed to be able to spend some time with us. Maybe this is just my illusion as a kid growing up in the 80s, but nowadays it is impossible to get a hold of the doctor. We go to these doctor complexes. It's not even the same doctor every time.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to call them on the phone and be like, hey, this or that prescription needs to be filled. You get some automated system that comes back. I mean, nobody has time anymore. There's such a high turnover rate. Doctors are always complaining that it's not like it used to be. Like, how do we change it so that we get back to that maybe a little bit more localized care from a doctor who is looking at you more holistically?
Well, that's
That's the huge question, but I'm just curious if you have an opinion.
no, I agree. So I think what you had before, you explained the family doctor. Someone had a long history with you that you went to for a long time, and they could understand you because they knew you since whatever age, and you're getting decades sometimes of experience, right? And it makes it easier for a doctor when he has decades.
Right.
But I think, when we've moved to kind of insurance situations, and this gets to where the complexity with the insurance, like it's been good and helpful to help maybe reduce costs and manage costs, but then it's also created a more difficult situation in managing patients because you have to switch your doctor every couple of years. You switch your insurance, you can't keep that doctor.
Oh, sure.
You have to. That's how people feel, unless you're going to pay out of pocket, right? So when we moved away, originally insurance started for major medical, and you can just buy that for hospitalization, which is kind of your biggest cost in the healthcare system. Is hospitalization. Drugs aren't the big expense in healthcare. Doctor visits aren't the biggest cost in healthcare. It's hospital expense, right? So you were able to have that, and you paid for your prescriptions, and you paid for everything else out of pocket. So you had more of those long-term relationships. But as that evolved, and now you can't buy insurance that isn't with a prescription plan, which doesn't have all that, you feel limited if you want to utilize that, right? And we almost need to get to breaking up the pieces and you being able to pick what's right for you. Like, I'd rather pay out of pocket going to a doctor and pay for my prescriptions out of pocket. It's cheaper than having insurance. And I'd rather pay for major medical if I go to the hospital to protect me.
That would be nice if you could pay major medical as
that's how it used to
just
be
in
the
case
70s.
you have a car explode or something, and then you got to put the pieces back together. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm the same way. I'm going to just give 2 really short tidbits here. We have 2 boys. One of them we had insurance for when we had him, and then the second one we're like, we're not going to have insurance for this one because it's cheaper to pay out of pocket for having the baby. And both of them ended up being the same price. They were about $10,000, $12,000, which is expensive. I had the same experience when I had surgeries. It's almost the same price that I paid out of pocket to have it with and without insurance. And so at the end, I was like, why do I even have this? So now it's cheaper for me to go to the doctor without insurance because I choose doctors who are very good and don't take insurance. And then it is to just go to the doctor down the road that costs you $200 every time you go to the doctor, and they don't really get to see you. So yeah, that's weird. But it would be nice to have that assurance that I have some protection in case the worst thing happens.
Well, yeah, and it used to be that, and I wish we could, because I would just buy the major medical and pay the rest out of pocket, because I'm relatively healthy, and I spend the money to be healthy and to be good. People that don't, take care of themselves,
right?
Then they need the insurance because that's where they're spending their money, right? So,
Right.
And this gets to where, universal healthcare. Should I pay for someone who's obese and has all these 5 complications because they don't take care of themselves?
Well,
Then they should pay more than I should. I shouldn't pay for them. They should pay.
Yeah,
for themselves.
so you bring up an interesting argument, and maybe this is just worth talking about because I think you have some insight here. My best friend is Swedish, and he is part of. He continually is telling me how little he pays for things, which is obvious because they have universal health care and he's in Sweden. And so like he has surgery and he's like, I paid $30. It was the tax for it. And I was like, oh, that's great. Well, I have insurance and I paid $5,000. So good for you.
Yeah, but he is,
and different things go back and forth. So why is it that we can't have the Swedish system? Now I have my own theories, but I'm curious what you think.
Well, do we need that? First of all, he is paying. So he's paying with heavy taxes. They are paying for it. Nothing is free in the world. So I think there's a misperception that, it's easy and it's free. I'll tell you, I've heard more stories that universal health care in European countries is not all it's cracked up to be, and they have problems. It's like, you have cancer? We have a slot in 6 months from now to treat you.
Well, it is interesting with incentives in that respect, because here's our personal example here. I had some knee trauma when I was 30, and I went into the doctor and they said, okay, well, we have a slot in 2 weeks. Why don't we get you in? We'll clean that up and get you out the door. My friend Jonas had a similar knee injury. He actually had his 4 months before mine, and when he went in, he was required to do 3 months of rehab before to try to heal it. And then none of that worked. And so then they got him in and finally got him a slot. But it took 4 months. I'm not sure if that's because of the incentive system, but they try as hard as possible to not do the surgery. Whereas I feel like I was highly encouraged to do the surgery as quick as possible. And I don't even know if I necessarily needed it. I'm pretty sure I did because they took out a lot of cartilage. But in some ways, it would have been nice to try to rehab it first before I went into the surgery. But yeah, they always push last case scenario, we do the big thing.
I agree. That happens a lot of times. And then it just gets to training and finding the right doctor and advocating for yourself. Well,
and you don't necessarily know either.
Correct.
So
that's the thing. But you need to train people, like, what are the alternatives? All the alternatives. And, the incentive does do that. If you're going to an orthopedic surgeon, how do they make their money? They make the money by surgery. They don't make money by...
And I think if you go in at least as a customer and you know that there is an incentive structure for whoever you go into, like, don't necessarily take the only opinion you have from the orthopedic surgeon. Go to at least somebody else who's not an orthopedic surgeon and say, what is your opinion on it? Maybe somebody who does rehab, ask them, have you rehabbed people like this before?
Or just ask, what's the success rate? Like, people don't ask enough questions. They just blindly go with the doctor. And I understand why, because they're not experts and it's overwhelming for them. Like, I know my mom's going to go, she's not going to ask questions. She's not going to, because she feels intimidated. Right. So I get that. So,
and also you just want to, maybe the takeaway is get a second opinion. If someone is listening to this, get a second opinion from someone who's had a lot of things go wrong.
Or
don't take the first one, because doctors are people. They're just like us. They're not these superhumans.
I think second opinion's good, but I would say ask questions first. Before second opinion, ask questions and make sure you understand from who you're going to. And then if you need to, get a second opinion. Because if you ask the right questions, you may get the answers from the doctor.
That's true. But of course, you don't know what questions always to ask. And sometimes after you've gone to the first person, you've thought about it and you're like, oh, maybe I'll ask this other person some questions that I should have asked the first person.
I agree.
True. And second opinions are expensive too. So I get why you wouldn't do that. But
no, I agree with you. But there's some simple questions which aren't that complicated. Like, what are the other alternatives? What else can I do? What's the success rate? Those are not complicated. Those are not you're an expert. But if we were able to, in the best of worlds, have some sort of little, here's the 10 questions to ask when you go to a doctor,
That's
that
true.
people could
That's
have
true,
a
yeah,
cheat
yeah.
sheet, that would help. But they don't always think that way, and not
Sure,
all people.
sure.
Some people do up front. But I think, yes, the incentives are part of the system. I think, a lot of people, if they're relatively healthy, they love universal health care. They go in and out. They don't pay a lot of money. They are paying. They're paying a lot in heavy taxes. They're paying significantly more taxes than we pay here. So, we pay insurance to pay for it. So somebody's paying for it one way or the other.
Well, it's true. So back to that Swedish thing. I mean, okay, I've thought through this a lot, and I'm not complaining because we live in different systems. Jonas and I, we make similar amounts of money, not much higher than what a teacher makes, but at that level, we're paying the same in taxes. If I make any more, I will definitely be paying less than he would if he made significantly more. So there's like a little bit of a threshold right now where we're somewhat equal. But the other thing that I find interesting is that I go to Sweden and there is a cultural difference in the way people take care of themselves. So you walk around pretty much anywhere in Sweden, in the large cities at least, which is where I visit most, and you don't have the same percentage of obese people. In fact, it's really rare to see a morbidly obese person, whereas here I just have to go to Walmart and it's like every other person. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying it's shockingly apparent when you're in the South how many people are overweight. And so I start to think to myself, well, it would be nice to say, well, maybe we could just pay for universal health care for people, but I don't think we could, because Sweden comes from such a fit population, and they're quite homogenous. So like they're all dealing with the same genetic mix up, so to speak. I mean, in a way that's good for trying to treat people from a health perspective, right?
Yeah.
So, I keep telling Jonas, I was like, I think it would be great if we had that, but how are we going to do that here? It would cost 10 times more than it costs you guys to implement. And I just don't know how we fix that. I feel like we have to fix people who need to get healthy first. Well, and then we could do that. Or people just maybe we need to focus on the education or something.
Education and lifestyle, right? So some of that gets to lifestyle. So in those Scandinavian countries, I think that's relatively true. Although all around the world, obesity levels are increasing, right? In many ways because of lifestyle, right? And you can go into the whole food system and stuff and what impact that has.
Right.
But it's a lot easier because culturally, in terms of their diet, you do have a more homogenous kind of gene pool in terms of how you're treating. We're more heterogeneous in the U.S., so that is one of the complicating factors here. And then the size and scope of what you're doing in the U.S. compared to Sweden. Mm-hmm. You're dealing with far less amount of people. The smaller the amount of people, the easier it is to kind of manage all those complexities.
I don't think people quite grasp the difference in Sweden versus the U.S. when they try to say, oh, we should be more like Scandinavian countries. I mean, Sweden has 3 cities, more or less. I mean, they're little towns in between, but it's Gothenburg, Stockholm, and Malmö, which is right across from Copenhagen, which is kind of more of a metropolis. But I mean, that's it. And I think it's 9 million people. You said more than that recently, but I think it's closer to 9 million.
Well, in Europe,
that is tiny. It's tiny. That'd be like Vermont doing a universal healthcare system for Vermont. That would be possible, probably.
Yeah, exactly. And I used the larger numbers when we talked about Europe when we talked before, but some of those countries are 30 million people. So they're only having maybe 10 million there. So it varies by country.
Yeah.
But you see, what's an interesting trend is more and more people in Europe are buying healthcare, buying insurance because the healthcare system is failing, right? So it used to be only the rich people outside of the government system because they can't get treated when they want, and they can't get the drugs that they want the most. They can't get the best technologies or the newest drugs, right, with better efficacy and low and better safety, that they're paying outside of it. Now it's moving down to the middle class. So whereas maybe it was only like a couple percentage of people say that in England that we're buying this extra insurance, it's probably in some countries maybe getting to 20-30% of people are buying additional insurance, even though they're paying into the healthcare system that's free. They're paying it so they can get treated when they want. They don't have to like fly to Turkey to get treated or something like that, which was a lot of people were doing in Europe when they needed a surgery or something. But particularly for some situations like with oncology, they are buying it so they can get treated as quickly and as efficiently as they can. So it, and it's different across different countries in Europe, but it's easy to say, oh, it's so easy, it's so simple, and it's getting more complex there than anything else,
Right. That's interesting. I think that probably dives into a whole weed of things that maybe we don't want to go into. But let me note this. So I've made a whole bunch of videos now that are related to natural medicines. So I'm picking apart plants and fungi that people have used anciently, and now they're somewhat unregulated. So let me first start by saying this. In the YouTube comments, I've been able to see a few trends of where people are. I'll take an example. Say this Amanita muscaria, the red and white Mario Brothers mushroom. When I talk about that and I talk about some of the benefits, here are 3 different things people say. First of all, people will say, oh, well, there's a reason people aren't using it, and it's because there's no money to be made. Big Pharma doesn't want that info to get out. You're going to get squashed, which is borderline conspiracy theory, I think, but there could be some truth to it.
Based on some facts.
Based on some facts. Yeah. Okay.
There's some truth to that. There's some truth to that, because if you don't have intellectual property, the thing though, if there was an active ingredient there and someone could patent it, they could make money. So it's not necessarily broad-based true that that's the case, but that does have an impact, and that is a factor in there. I think
can you patent compounds that are in natural, like in a plant?
Yes and no.
Like acetaminophen from willow, you talked about that. Yeah. I guess from aspirin. So, do you know more about this? Is it acetyl salicylic acid, which comes from willows, and then it was purified into acetaminophen, or what? I don't know. Maybe you don't know anything about that.
Aspirin is different than acetaminophen, right? So acetaminophen's Tylenol, right?
Okay.
So, but they were able to figure out they would just say chew on willow bark is how it started, right?
Sure.
And then they were able to isolate the specific aspects of it and fine tune it. And then through our understanding of chemistry, we've been able to synthesize a specific chemical, and then we can make that in a lab, so to speak, synthetically. Right. So that's the process that you usually follow with natural medicine. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of drugs that are made from snake venom, or they're from soils, like antibiotics out of soils, and they isolate the active ingredient, and then they see what effect that specifically has, taking away everything else that is in there. Right. So, I've done some work with Ayurvedic medicines. Yeah. Looking at India, and they use a lot of that approach to medicine, right? A kind of more holistic approach. And the challenge is that a lot of things in nature and the chemicals in it do have some sort of effect. Like anti-inflammatory is one of the biggest ones across the spectrum that you run into, that you have that effect, and that's great. Right. So, and it can work, and it may not work 100% or the same impact on every single person, because we have all different physiology. And you say, okay, why aren't we making those medicines? But people have tried to take that, do the right clinical studies to see what happens. And there's a couple problems. One is the amount that you would need of that plant or that isolate is so huge. It doesn't make any sense.
Sure.
Right? It's kind of like they say, to get all the benefits of what a carrot does, you would turn orange because you're eating so much beta carotene if you're just going to eat the carrot to get that benefit of the vitamins. right? So that's the first problem, is kind of dosage. And then when you get up to that dosage, you have side effects. So even though there's an effect on something, how much of that and for who is it for? So you say, okay, let's do clinical trials to see the effect. The thing is, as you start anecdotally, what works for you may or may not work for me. But as we go to a larger number of people, that effect doesn't hold up. And it doesn't hold up for that efficacy level that you would need to get an approval. And then you run into safety issues. And so people have tried to take these Ayurvedic medicines, and the clinical studies don't hold up. And part of that, I think, is because we can't figure out right now. We're getting to a point with genetics where we can look at your physiology and say, this drug's going to work for you. It's not going to work for you. This other drug will work for you. That's why there's sometimes you need 6 or 7 of a drug. People say, oh, you have too many me too's. It's like, well, everybody's different in how their body reacts. And so it's kind of a, trial and error kind of situation on a lot of drugs. But we're getting there. And oncology is one of the first places where we can look at specific mutations. And we have drugs that treat a specific mutation to block a receptor site to help really ameliorate or even maybe cure cancer in some cases. But because we don't have the technology to pick that out, when you go to broad-based studies, these trials tend to fail. So the reason some of those haven't gotten to market, these natural medicines, is because it doesn't hold up in a broad-based population. And we can't isolate 20% of the people this would be beneficial for. We can't figure out how to figure that up front. This will work for you.
Okay, so let me get back to this mushroom that we were talking about, because I feel like I know it a little bit more, and I can think through that. So Amanita muscaria has a couple of active ingredients in it, ibotenic acid and muscimol. And there does seem to be one company which found a way to isolate muscimol, and they brought a product to market, and they put a bunch of money in behind trying to do the trials on it. And I guess that is just a compound. Could somebody else come and say, here's also muscimol that we've isolated, but maybe we did it with a different technique? Or you see what I mean? Like,
you get into IP, you get into patent laws. So you can have a patent for a compound. You created a compound. You can have a patent on a process. You can have a patent in terms of utility. You can I can have, I have the patent on using this compound to treat nausea, and then nobody else, you're protected for that for a period of time. But if I'm using that for something else like congestion, then that could be a separate patent. It gets a little bit more.
But it has to be an isolated thing. So like this company is taking the mushroom and isolating one chemical compound. People aren't doing studies necessarily just on the mushroom, because there wouldn't be a way to make money from that, right? Because people could go out and just pick it and use the knowledge of whatever that study is, right? Like,
well, also you're taking into other things that you don't need. So you're isolating what the active ingredient is, and hopefully this gets to dosage, because the amount of mushrooms you would need to get the effect may be a little crazy. It would be unhealthy for you to take that much mushroom, right? Because we don't digest those, and it could mess up your whole digestive system, right? So you're isolating that, and you can just have that, small amount that has the effect. So I think that's really why you would isolate. So they could own the trade secret on how to get to that, or they can they isolate the compound if no one has, have intellectual property on that. They may be able to own that for a period of time that protects them, and then that protects them. They can either make that for other people. They can make money off of it in some way because it's protected.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, how do we get more basic research on some of the herbs that people have been using for a long time? So for instance, Bacopa, which is the one that I did, which is an Ayurvedic medicine in its base. I did borage. I've done, I'm looking into things like chamomile and echinacea, and just things that you could grow in your garden and just take. It would be really great, from my perspective, as I'm doing these review videos, if there was a nice summation of how this worked on the general person, but there's so few studies. I mean, some of them are a little bit more. Bacopa, which I just did, there are quite a few studies on that, which is encouraging, but they're still quite low when it comes to double-blind placebo studies. There's like a couple of them. Is it, I mean, and it makes a lot of sense to me that pharmaceutical companies are running these trials. They need to be able to make money. And if they don't, where's the funding going to come from? But it also feels like from a public health perspective, it would be nice if people had some tools where they didn't have to go to the doctor. They could be like, oh, I need a little bit of this. It's in my garden. I'll just pick it and eat it. If governments say they are looking out for people's health, it feels like the government could fund those things, wouldn't it? I mean, wouldn't that be nice? Why can't we do more of that? Or am I missing that is the trend and people are doing it and I just don't know about it?
Well, I think, the government does fund a lot of that. I mean, there's a lot of, pork kind of money that people look at, in terms of these esoteric types of studies. So you rely on that because that's for the general public good, right?
Okay.
The thing is, a lot of times and for many of these medicines, there are a ton of studies. Mm-hmm. There may be, but even when there's a ton of studies, usually they're not well controlled or they're not large enough, and you don't have the consistency in terms of the protocol across all the studies to do that. So you'd almost need maybe a cooperative approach, and maybe across countries or something, where you can build enough of a sample size to test it out. And that might be like trying to herd cats, trying to herd academics together to collaborate on a project, maybe, right? Because everybody has their slight bent in it, and there could be a great benefit for that. And why isn't there? Like a lot of it just really gets down to money, right? Because it's not cheap to do that, and then because you have a lot of legal liability things that you have to watch for, and you have all the testing to see how well is that working, and then that gets into the cost of whether it's in vivo or in vitro testing or other types of tests, right? So all those costs add up really quickly, and so it's hard.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, I feel like there's so many directions we could go, so many things. I'm like, why is this a problem here? I will say that I have a lot of friends who are quite hippie in their essence, I'll put it that way. And their conclusion is that the whole system is messed up and they just need to throw it all in the trash can and start new. I don't necessarily believe that, because I feel like, why invent the wheel constantly when we got a wheel that's working, and maybe the best way in is to get into the wheel and refine it. And so that's kind of the approach that I'm taking is, well, here's a couple of problems. How can we refine a couple of these things instead of throw the whole thing in the trash can?
No, it's true. Because really what they're advocating is to go back to the 1800s, right? Where everybody could just do whatever they want and we just start from scratch. And that sounds nice, but it doesn't make sense, right? Because you have to start thinking about the scope of what you get to now and what's available, and then safety. So really what the government does is that, the FDA, it's not about as much efficacy, it's about safety of the people. Right. And the reason the laws are there and the reason what their job is really the safety of the public. And so you run into, we've learned a lot, and people could just run willy-nilly and try to do things, but there's a point where some regulation and rules make sense for the health and safety of people, and also for the consistency in terms of how we evaluate data and how we evaluate what can happen. Right? So you need that happy medium, but if you can lower the barriers to entry, that would make it a lot easier. Right? If there was some way to do that. But I understand where they're coming from. Like I say the only way to do universal healthcare in America is to abolish for-profit insurance companies. And that's what you would have to do.
I mean, that I think a lot of people can get behind that.
Yeah, but it probably
I feel like it's an impossible task. Why does that make you popular in the circles that you're in? Does everybody seem to agree with that, or are you an anomaly?
No, I think
I
people
mean, do
would.
you
I
not
mean,
say that in the, because it's a
no,
tricky system, to,
I mean, I say that all the time. When you get
yeah,
into those conversations, the thing is, the people I deal with, we understand the complexities, and
yeah,
once you understand healthcare systems, there's very few people who really understand systems that would say, "Oh, we need to go universal healthcare. We need to do what Europe does." Anybody that really understands our system and their system is never going to say that. So once you just say it's so complex, and our system, for better or worse, developed differently over time,
yeah,
and there's probably ways to kind of fix it. And again, like one of the ways might be allow a breakup of the components that you're going to get insurance on,
hmm,
which is what we used to have. Now it's like all or nothing.
right,
And if you're paying $1,000 a month for an insurance policy, probably 200 at least of that, 200 to 300 is for a prescription plan, whether you're using it or not.
oh, I
It's
see,
like, well, can't I just take out the prescription part and then I pay less? And there's no way to break that up. But so there may be some solutions that can help, but there's not going to be any cure necessarily very easily.
right,
And
right,
to have the government do it, would be a disaster, right?
yeah,
So we just know that just creates a bureaucracy, and it's inefficient, and it almost nothing ever works when
yeah,
the government's running it fully,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So we were talking a lot about drugs, which and medicines, and which you have great insight in. Before we finish things up, I wanted to kind of get to and hear your opinions on this particular view. I listened to everyone talk about what are the problems and how do we move forward and have a healthier America, like how do we regain that. And I'm a parent, and so I'm looking at two boys and I'm trying to do the best thing for them. And it seems to me like I look at all their friends and I look at their school system and I see what they're mixed into. And I try to encourage the direction to be somebody that by the time they're 30 or 40, they're super healthy and they're passing that on to their kids. And I can't get over the idea that we really are failing the kids right now in school. And it has nothing to do necessarily with drugs and healthcare, but it's kind of a cultural phenomenon in that, at least where I am, and I know this is different in different parts of the country because my brother has kids and it seems to be different. He's out in Oklahoma. I'm in North Carolina. My kids are in a middle-sized middle school. It's not huge. It's not one of those 1,000 kids per grade thing. But there's only 3 kids that play school sports, boys, 3 boys that play school sports. And they get bused to another school because they have to combine schools to play school sports. And I had a chat with the coach and I was like, I don't understand this. I don't, like, what are the kids doing in school? Are they not doing PE? And he's like, well, they have a PE period, but it's really health. During part of the school year, we'll let them go out to the track and they can walk if they want, or they don't have to. They could just sit and do nothing. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. I feel like every kid should be doing sports and that they should have a choice which one they do, not do you do a sport? Because teaching kids, we know that you should be working out an hour a day, especially as kids, but even as adults. If we don't give the kids that skill, then they don't have it. And sometime when they're 30 or 40 and, well, I'm going to say this bad, but they're overweight and they're unhealthy, they're going to have to figure out how to learn that skill. And so wouldn't it be great if we could just teach them then? And on top of that, the school lunches are terrible. I mean, they have ice cream and pizza and French fries. And I don't, and that's their choice. It's their choices.
For some schools, there's vending machines, right? So
and vending. And on top of that, vending machines, they can choose where they want to get their food. Yes. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
I agree.
Appalled.
I agree. And I think, I don't know if every kid needs to do a sport, but I think what you need to teach is physical activity. And that when I was younger, that's what you did.
I mean, it doesn't have to be a competitive thing, but
no.
You need to be doing something.
Physical activity. Yeah. Right? And teach people alternatives. And, when I was younger, we always had that. You had art, you had music offered.
Yeah.
You had, health, which was gym, or PE. And I think that, it's just these budget cuts and what they're looking to fund. And like,
Yeah,
I had the same thing.
Maybe that is budget cuts. I don't know what it is. I'm a little bit worried that it's we're giving kids too many choices. Like, do you want to do this? No, okay, you don't have to. You could just not do it. And every kid is going to choose video games and not working out over, whatever it is. And I think, well,
a lot of kids would.
Part of it.
Yeah. But that gets to a cultural thing, and it gets to some
definitely.
of it's budget, but it's, but it's also, there's an aspect of parents paying attention and parents being involved, because some of the parents, I just let it happen. I mean, we can go into a whole other thing on schools because I'm involved in what's going on in school curriculums and stuff. I kind of tangentially follow that because I think that's one of the biggest dangers in America. Parents aren't paying attention and they're appalled. And we're taking away things like there's school districts here where they try in Massachusetts where they try to take out Greek and Roman history for gender studies, right? So it's like you're eliminating history to talk about gender and having 12 books over 12 weeks on that. So it's like, well, what are schools there to do? And do we need to redefine that? This will be educating kids to hopefully be productive adults in society, right?
Yeah, well, in part of, from my perspective, you're overwhelmed with all the things that you have to do. And it's not very easy to choose the thing that will help the kid. Does that make sense?
Every kid's different.
Yeah, well, for instance, I definitely, because of the lack of physical education in the schools, I'm like, okay, we got to get you in different things after school. But because there's not as many kids doing it, it's not like, it's just next door. I've got to drive half an hour each way every day to these different activities. And the kids then don't have their friends that are in their classes because none of their friends are doing the sports. And, so I have sympathy for the parents because it's just so difficult to do all of these things. And at the same time, it's easier in other places. I know my brother who's in Oklahoma, schools just offer all these things. And the easiest option for them is to let the kids continue to do the sports programs. And then they pick them up 2 hours later and it's great. So it's not everywhere.
No, and I think historically you didn't have to worry about it. So
right, yeah, I know
your parents didn't,
definitely.
You didn't, so you don't think about it.
Right,
so it's
right.
Only the newest generation where you need to be double checking on that stuff. Where you're so busy with everything else in your life, and we're overwhelmed with information that it's hard to keep up. Right, and it's hard for a parent to keep up these days.
Yeah.
And to keep track of things. There's so many more moving parts out there in terms of what's going on.
Yeah.
And to learn about, like, you're just trying to learn for yourself. Like a lot of the people you said you're working in your training class, just teaching them how to think about food and rest and movement and all that stuff is hard. Never mind getting down to the kids, but it does all flow together. And some of that just gets down to education and just figure out how do you do that. And if the schools aren't doing it, then you have to figure out how to supplement that and do it yourself.
The thing I've been most encouraged by is that there does seem to be a trend nowadays towards people talking about health and podcasts that are talking about health, and those have become popular, and people have started to take that into their own hands. And maybe this has happened for decades and decades, but I like that there seems to be the trend. Maybe it's just in my feed because that's where I am at right at the moment. But I think people can take their own health into their hands and make a positive improvement for themselves on a long-term basis. And I'm encouraged by that. You don't need the government to step in to tell you how to be healthy. You can do it. So that's the thing I'm encouraged by. And I like that more and more people are coming to the forefront that are talking about it in a good way. So I am hoping that message gets out there to people and that people can figure out how to start making that change. So
I think that's true too. And I think people they didn't know that they needed to learn, right? So you don't know what you don't know. Mm-hmm. And I think people are open to it. And I think it's so much easier to get that information than 20 years ago. You can go to the internet, you can find out anything, but then you don't know what to believe. I think
that is challenging. Yeah.
fitness and nutrition. You read one article that says to do this, the other article says to do the opposite. One article says walking is great and really good for you, and some people say walking is a waste of your time.
Right.
The elliptical is worse.
Right.
And I've studied over many years in trying to understand, and it's confusing, when you're kind of educated on it. Never mind if you're not educated and you're just starting out, even with foods,
Yeah. Oh, I feel terrible for people who maybe have gone through the cycle of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s fitness trends. Well, not even fitness trends, diet trends. My parents being one of them. I want to call out my parents too much, but I did have this conversation with my mom, and she's like, it doesn't matter what you eat. I mean, people said butter was bad and then margarine was good, and now they're like, margarine's bad. And I don't care. It doesn't matter anymore. Just eat what you want. That's her conclusion. Because I'm trying to talk through like, oh, I don't know, Mom, that's not so great for you. And
yeah, but she's at an age.
You go through that so much. It's like, okay, I get it. Yeah, you just be like, it doesn't even matter.
Well, she's at the age where, okay, I made it this far. I'm not going to change. It's too hard to change a habit, right? So I get it. Like my mom's like, I like Campbell soups. I'm eating them, like, but they're full of sodium. They're not good for you. She's like, yeah, but I grew up with it. Like I've been doing this for 80 years. It's hard to change. Right. How many more years do I have? Is it going to make a difference?
That's true. Yeah, so maybe not. But I also, and I think people maybe misunderstand how science works and our understanding. Maybe it was some random writer in Time magazine back in 1980 that vilified butter and said margarine is what you should be eating, right? Like how much knowledge did that one person have? And so then my parents are seeing that as like, oh, here's what the industry says, or this is what scientists are saying. And yet scientists were always trying to figure out like what is better, what is healthier. We're not really sure, but it gets translated through influencers, so to speak, throughout the ages. And it takes a little bit of a discerning eye to figure out what is the best thing for you to eat long term. Red meat had its time. My kids still tell me from their science teacher, like, red meat's terrible for you. You shouldn't eat it. And I was like, hold on. I'm not so sure about that. True. Let's wait on that. And they're like, why, Dad? And I was like, well, you understand I run a company called Stone Age Man, right? And that if you look back to our Stone Age ancestors, what did they eat? Why would we not be adapted to eat red meat? There's no reason for that.
Well, there's a hypothesis, that really the reason human beings, improved in intelligence and size is really because of the protein from meat.
Yeah, and I think the theory, right, is that with fire, we could cook and eat red meat or meat without getting parasites and stuff so easily, right? And so you could have that protein. Yeah.
It gets complicated, but I always try to think like anything in moderation, right? So anything in the extreme is going to be bad for you. So when you look at margarine versus butter and all that, it gets to be a volume thing and how much, but it's also your metabolism and how your body reacts. So, maybe some people do need a higher percent of protein. Some people can live on a higher percentage of carbs because no one diet works. People say, oh no, pasta's bad, carbs are bad. But then you have these places in the world where they have huge amounts of carbs and they're fine for their metabolism, right? Or even cholesterol, the whole cholesterol, the myth about cholesterol and cardiovascular disease, correlation isn't necessarily causation. And we bastardize that. And as we're learning more, we're finding out more truths of how a lot of information was hidden. And there were reasons made, maybe for nefarious reasons by food companies and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
That starting to come out where they hid results really for profits more than what was good health, maybe.
Yeah. I agree. Well, you know what, Kevin? I think we've chatted now for almost an hour and 20 minutes. Maybe we should wrap this conversation up now and try to put up a conversation in the future, especially when something hits the news that we can talk about that's related to pharma. That might be useful for us. I feel like there's so many routes that we could take with the knowledge that you have, and I really appreciate you sharing all of that. I'm not sure we got to any conclusions today, but I think it was useful to talk through and I really liked hearing the history of where Big Pharma came from. And I think that's useful for people to understand. And yeah, maybe there's a few tidbits people could take from this and enjoyed listening to.
Yeah, I think, I enjoy the conversation. I don't know if there's not an easy answer or it would be solved, right? So
Right.
It is complex, but I think, exposing people to more of the context and the history helps you understand where it's at. And so you're understanding the causes helps you to maybe create solutions, right? So people make blanket statements like, which are kind of annoying because they're out of context and you don't have the perspective like, oh, the FDA is all funded by pharmaceutical companies. And it's like, well, that's kind of false. That's not really true necessarily. Like there's truth, they're twisting it for when companies need to put in to get drugs evaluated, they're paying for the license and they're paying for someone to evaluate that. Just like when you get a driver's license, you're paying the government for your license. So the RMV is funded by you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, does that mean that they're biased to you? No. They're not biased to people in that. And when you go to start a business or you want a patent, you pay the government for that. Are they biased to give that to you because you paid the money? No, that's not necessarily true. Just because you're paying for services and you're helping to fund that evaluation by the government for safety, it's not necessarily that it's like someone just gave you $100 million to fund you and you owe them. It's not like NATO, where everybody puts in a piece and the countries with the bigger money put into NATO have more control. That's not how the FDA works. It's not how government agencies work, but we all fund those government agencies with fees, and you're paying for licenses and you're paying for someone to evaluate that, right? And to evaluate the data, hopefully on an unbiased way for the safety of people. So there's things like that where they're kind of misrepresented and it's an easy soundbite, but there's more to it than that. And by understanding that, then you can evaluate it. The truth is usually somewhere in between, right? Mm-hmm. So even these conspiracy theories are based in some truths,
right?
And then they get twisted. Mm-hmm. So it's just trying to understand objectively what are the components and how does that. It's about a system and a process, and the systems are kind of broken.
Yeah.
But how do we fix them? It takes a lot of thought. And I appreciate you're trying to take the thought through all these pieces and you're trying to intermingle. And that's the challenge we have right now is things aren't isolated. So drugs and health isn't isolated from your sleep, from your diet. We need to get back to those interrelationships and understand them and how do we manage and balance them. And it is kind of a balance.
Well, I'll just kind of end with this thought and you can tell me what you think before we go, but everyone is quite upset with where health is right now and healthcare, and for good reason. And they're arguing over who's responsible. And that can feel like an existential crisis for people. I think it can make people anxious. It can make people depressed, even angry. What I like to communicate to people is that we a little bit know the solutions. I'm coming up with a recipe, a Stone Age Man recipe, which I'm going to try to put into an upcoming book, but it's really simple. You can look at our Stone Age past and you can try to, in this modern system that we live in, take cues from how our bodies are adapted. Like, for instance, if I was to look at us from outer space and I was an alien and I was like, what do humans need? Well, how did they originally evolve in their system? Well, what was their diet like? Maybe modify your diet a little bit more like that. And you don't have to go paleo, although, because you're looking into the paleo times, but probably more fruits and vegetables and meats. You probably need exercise because we had a lot more exercise than we do now in the modern world. You should probably integrate into nature a little bit more than most people do. Most people do almost nothing, but we lived in nature, like out of necessity. Now we have to choose it. Then from an existential perspective, we had purpose because we had to eat. Now we have to invent purpose, so you have to make sure that's a part of it. We were part of a community. Nowadays, people are so isolated, so that has to be part of it. And then the last thing, which is a little bit difficult, maybe there's the spirituality or an art and spirituality piece. People were connected to a higher purpose, a higher being than them. And now everyone feels like they're responsible for everything that happens, and that's not always necessarily good. So my feel is that we know those things. The easiest ones are diet, exercise, and probably getting into nature a little bit more. But start with those and then try to mix in a community, try to find your sense of purpose. We know that that's how things worked in the past. We know some of those things are broken. You can probably take it into your own hands, and you don't need to argue constantly over who's paying for what healthcare to get healthy. That's my perspective. So.
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective, and I agree. It's there's no one cause; it's multifactorial, and it's finding those pieces. But I think kind of getting back to the basics in a way, to what you're kind of alluding to, makes a lot of sense. And let's learn from our history. Let's go back and kind of take the best of what we understand, and to help us move forward in a better way. And I tend to agree with you on all of that.
Well, let's queue up another conversation in the future, Kevin. It was a pleasure to chat with you, and thank you for spending the time, and good luck with your new ventures as they come about, and also your health journey.
Yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed speaking to you as I always do, and look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin.
All right, have a good day. So long.
Okay, let me just stop this.